Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Trade talks are back on. Following last week's decision by the federal government to remove most of Canada's retaliatory tariffs, our Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc took a flight down to Washington. And on Tuesday, he held his first meeting in some time with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Lutnick is President Trump's point man for negotiating with Canada. Now, the meeting lasted about 90 minutes, and Minister LeBlanc's office says he left D.C. with a sense that progress has been made. During his trip to Europe, Prime Minister Mark Carney says this new round of negotiations with the White House will focus on 5 areas.
Those are in strategic sectors for the Americans: aluminum, steel, autos, copper. They happen to have a specific on copper. And then, of course, lumber, softwood lumber, which has been an issue. So those are the areas where immediately we are focused on improving the outcomes, if we can.
For months, the White House had been saying that Canada's countermeasures were a barrier to negotiations, and talks hit a standstill after Trump's August 1st deadline passed, with the president increasing tariffs on Canadian goods not covered under our trade deal CUSMA to 35%. Now, most of our trade is still tariff-free because the U.S. is exempting goods that fall under CUSMA. And in that spirit, Prime Minister Mark Carney decided to match that by lifting our retaliatory tariffs on tens of billions of dollars worth of goods that also fall under our trade deal. Counter tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos still remain in place. Not everyone is happy with this decision. Some believe we should still be fighting fire with fire. But in defending the move, Mark Carney used a hockey analogy. He says there's a time in the game to put your elbows up in the corner, and there are times to focus on stick handling and putting the puck in the net. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, we're going to dive a little bit deeper about the resumption of negotiations with William Pellerin, an international trade lawyer with McMillan, LLP. Thank you very much for being here.
Absolutely. Happy to chat.
So the long pause is over and the two sides are talking again. What can we expect out of this new round of negotiations? What's your take on all of this?
So I think that this is very positive news for the Canadian economy, for the federal government. This all looks like it stemmed from the Government of Canada's recent decision to drop many of the counter tariffs that we had imposed. And that dropping looks like it unlocked the resumption of negotiations, which really had stalled since the start of the month.
Was that the right move in your eyes to drop the retaliatory tariffs? When we talk about negotiations, some people believe we gave up part of our ammunition by doing that. Others believe that it was the right thing to do, given some of the discrepancies over what was being tariffed and what wasn't compared to the U.S. and Canada. What's your take on this?
Yeah, so dropping the counter tariffs is really good for 2 reasons. And I do want to say that not everyone's happy with it. We certainly have clients that are deeply unhappy by the move, whereas we have others that welcomed it with a big sigh of relief. So generally, 2 reasons why this made sense at the time for most Canadian businesses. First, it reopens the door to negotiations, as we mentioned. So dropping it really... At this point, no other countries had really retaliated against the United States. The retaliation that Canada had in place didn't really seem like it was working. So it really made sense from that perspective to drop the tariffs. This is going to be welcome relief to consumers and to importers and retailers across the country, right? Let's not forget, we keep telling the United States that they shouldn't impose tariffs because they're a tax on importers. Well, that's true for them is true for us, right? Ultimately, if we are imposing these tariffs, then it means that goods are more expensive and prices are going to come down for a large number of Canadians, both businesses and consumers. So things like infant car seats, things like hot water tanks and hot water heaters for your home, and clothing and orange juice are all things on which Canada was applying a counter tariff and that became more expensive because of those tariffs. So removing those tariffs will allow the prices to come down on a large swath of products. So ultimately, I think generally speaking, the right move for Canada, understanding that there are businesses out there that don't do well with the lifting of the tariffs.
So what are those sectors that are not doing well and not pleased right now that the government's made this move to advance negotiations?
Yeah, it's really Canadian manufacturers, right? So if you're in the business of making something in Canada and selling that product in Canada, then reopening the door to U.S. product flowing into the country is really quite unfortunate and increases competition. That's all fine and fair in the normal course, but in many instances, those Canadian manufacturers might not be able to ship in the same way to the United States. So a useful example here, for example, are semi-trailers. So semi-trailers are now actually hit under the U.S. steel tariff. So if a Canadian manufacturer of semi-trailers is trying to sell a semi-trailer to the United States, they have to pay the part of the steel tariff that the United States has imposed. And on the other hand, U.S. producers of semi-trailers can ship tariff-free into Canada. And so it's those types of nuances that really irk Canadian manufacturers and where the dropping of the tariff is overly unhelpful.
Can we trust the White House to bargain in good faith now that we've dropped the retaliatory tariffs, even though they said that this was the main roadblock in the way of continuing talks? I mean, what good is an olive branch if they're constantly hitting us with a hammer?
It's very hard to deal with the U.S. administration. We're seeing that with the EU today, where they had a deal and now it looks like there could be additional tariffs because they have a digital service tax in some instances, right? So there's one thing after the other. You think you have a deal in place and there's another tariff that comes out for some other additional reason. So there's no question that Canada has some work to do. It's not clear how firm any deal can be, but we are going after the big prize, and the big prize that no other country has been able to achieve. And that's the idea of actually getting the steel, aluminum, and autos tariffs removed, those sectoral tariffs. And frankly, that's worth swinging for. So the EU and Japan and the UK, when they sign their deals with the United States, such as they are, we're not able to get those steel tariffs dropped at all. And so, but for Canada, that's really important. And simply regaining access to the U.S. market for those very integrated industries becomes really important, and it's worth jumping into those negotiations for.
We'll have more on the big story in just a moment with William Pellerin, an international trade lawyer with McMillan LLP, where we're examining the resumption of trade talks between Canada and the U.S. If no other country that's landed deals with the U.S. has been able to move President Trump on those sectoral tariffs, what are the chances that Canada would actually be able to pull this off?
It's a really good question. I think probably still low-ish odds. That said, Canada, I think, has more to offer in terms of continental defense and security arrangements. We are their more integrated trading partner. We can show and have shown the integration of the auto and steel industries and aluminum that can benefit both sides. We can show increased collaboration on critical minerals and things that the U.S. needs to distance itself from China. I think we have a unique card that we can play and that no one else can play.
Now, we've both talked about the fact that it's constantly changing. New tariffs pop up, in the latest as well, on top of digital services taxes, which he's talked about before with Canada. He's also investigating our lumber industry, which is already facing, I believe, a 35% tariff. That could increase even further. Where does that stand? I know lumber is a point of discussion, a little bit separate from the talks, but also very much related. Do you think we could make progress there in trying to resolve the ongoing lumber dispute that has been going on since, I believe, the early 80s?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we do a lot of work in the lumber space for Canadian businesses. Lumber is a perennial trade dispute. It really is its own thing because there are allegations there of dumping and subsidization. So these are tariffs that have been imposed following investigations by the United States Department of Commerce. They're not unilateral tariffs in the same way as these steel and aluminum tariffs that are just imposed at the president's whim, effectively. And so these are going to be far more difficult to drop and really require a true agreement and a true negotiation. And so I don't think that there is very high likelihood of a deal including lumber and getting those tariffs dropped. It would likely need actual consent by the U.S. lumber industry to make that happen. Doesn't look like the U.S. lumber industry is there. There's absolutely worth trying. But I think the only thing that is likely to come out of these negotiations is the hope that the United States doesn't impose an additional tariff on Canadian softwood lumber above and beyond the anti-dumping and anti-subsidy tariff that they've imposed. So they've threatened to do that, to increase through the use of the national security tariff, another tariff on top of that. And that would be extremely damaging to an industry that's already very, very hard hit.
And do you think Trump might do that as a point of leverage in these negotiations?
It's entirely possible. It's part of the modus operandi, certainly, of the U.S. administration to impose tariffs and then gain some concession. In this case, I'm not sure what more we have to offer, and it does look like we're getting very close and have made a lot of headway here. So hopefully that doesn't happen. And I think in this instance, it might be very damaging to the U.S. economy and to the housing market in particular, because that tariff is already going to cause a lot of pain for U.S. consumers and home builders.
Yeah, so that was my last question on this with the lumber dispute. How would it impact the industry and jobs in our economy here in Canada? And how much would the U.S. be almost shooting itself in the foot with such a tariff, given they also have a lot of the inflation and housing issues that we have?
That's exactly right. That's the card that Canada has to play with respect to lumber. There's no doubt that we are going to see curtailments in the lumber industry, particularly if there's an additional tariff that gets levied on top of that. But the Canadian production is simply not entirely substitutable, and the U.S. lumber industry can't pick up the 25% of the market that is supplied by Canada, simply. So at this point, it would simply be a major tax on U.S. housing starts.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. William, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Absolutely my pleasure.
And once again, that was William Pellerin, an international trade lawyer with McMillan LLP, speaking with me about Canada and the U.S. talking again, negotiating again at the White House after a long pause in talks. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can also find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.